And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and we are continuing our series of episodes on the Holomovement as the narrative of our universe and the biblical narrative as also being a holo movement. So I'm glad you've joined us today. We're really going to get into the crux of one of the most confusing Christian teachings that there are. I've talked to pastors, I've talked to people that used to be in churches who have asked question after question only to get nebulous answers, if any answers at all, with regard to the subject of the law and grace. The law and grace. It is a very confusing subject, and rightly so. And we'll see that the problem goes back all the way to the Christology handed down by the Roman Empire, a Christology which resulted in the formation of what we know today as Christianity, meaning the Roman Empire interpreted Christology to be a new religion, that Jesus is the founder of that new religion. It stands over against all other world religions. And then all of the various doctrines and creeds and so forth that have followed after that, which have led us to this place today, which I'm going to unpack. And we're going to talk about both the positive and the negatives of where Christianity is. I'm going to end this series with my personal message, if you will, to progressive Christianity, to take its next step. It is offering a number of very positive things, but is still identified with the 2,000-year-old interpretation of Christology. And we're going to talk about why that's very problematic and why all these elements I'm going to talk about are so blasted confusing to people. So, in this series, I've been talking about the biblical narrative as Holomovement. What does the universe, our universe, and its whole, W-H-O-L, Holomovement or holo process have to do with the law? We're going to talk for a few episodes. I don't even know how many, whatever it takes. What does the Holomovement have to do with the law in the biblical narrative? So first, let's remember the universe as consisting of two orders. Our universe has an explicate and an implicate order. The explicate order is our universe of forms or things. The stars, the planets, solar systems, galaxies, all of these forms are interconnected, and they must have law. They must have various laws that define their relationship with each other. So there is in our own universe the presence of law. There is law of gravity, law of relativity, laws of thermodynamics, etc., etc. Without these laws, our universe could not exist. Our universe could not continue to grow or evolve. All of this comes from a single source called an implicate order. The implicate order preceded our universe of forms or things. Our universe, or rather the implicate order, preceded the necessary laws that ensure the existence of our universe. Therefore, the implicate order transcends law, just as it transcends forms and things. Once you get to the implicate order, there's no form, so there's no law. Now, because our identity comes from source, meaning the implicate order, there's also no laws needed to govern our identity. Human identity is our innate God-given nature. God, of course, is the term used in the biblical narrative for source. And remember, source, implicate, God. That cosmology transcends law. There's no separation in the implicate order, no separation then in God's space. But there is in the explicate order of diversity, forms, and things. They both exist. Separation must exist in order to understand and define the explicate order of diversity. You have to separate this from that in order to know the difference between a planet, a star, etc., all the way through to our existence. Now, the holomovement, it's the movement between those two orders. It's the flow, the undivided flow between those two orders. The holomovement is showing how diversity in the explicate order is held in unity with the implicate order. It is an undivided flow between two orders. So how exactly is this held together as a whole? So now what I want to do is to turn to the biblical narrative to investigate the role and function of the law. If the cosmology of our universe is founded upon a source beyond forms or things, what about biblical cosmology? Because the implicate order of our universe preceded law. What about biblical cosmology? For it is in the implicate order, the God space, if you will, that is the source of our identity. So we want to study in these episodes how the law relates to our God identity. Now, what we're proposing is this. We're proposing Christology in the biblical narrative. It's Christology that's the movement or process, just like the holomovement or process in our universe. Christology and holomovement are both the same in role or function. They are the flow between two orders, an explicate and an implicate order. So how can law be necessary on one hand in this explicate world of form, while at the same time our identity transcends law? And if Christology is interpreted as a form, meaning a religion, instead of it being interpreted as we propose as transform, how has this confused the whole subject of law and grace, which we think it has? That's a lot to unpack. Quantum physics is a lot to unpack too, let me say. And look, one has to go there to find the answer to our amazing existence. You don't just watch a video and know everything there is to know about quantum physics. It takes work to understand its complexity. Not everybody will have an interest in this. I know that. Some people are not interested in the biblical narrative at all. And then there are others that they just don't want to get into all of the things that we'll be getting into, but which are necessary if we're to understand the answers to so many questions that continue to confuse and separate and denominate and so forth. So we have to go into the narrative itself. We have to dig into the text. I believe the answer to a unitive narrative. I believe the answer to universal human identity. I believe the answer to oneness is to dig deeper into the text. This is where I would differ with progressive Christianity, which I will talk about at the end of these episodes, which I believe has felt the need to get further away from much of the text, distance itself from much of the text, in order to have this unity and wholeness. What we're saying is it doesn't require that. But what it will require is for progressive Christianity to look in the mirror and ask itself questions about its very own identity. So let's go to the biblical narrative and to the elements of this. And I am going to now pull up my chart and see if I can share it. Let's see if I can share my chart. Wouldn't that be amazing if I could actually do that? I'll go to share screen. I'll go to my window. I will go to my chart. And amazing. I did it. Okay. Here's the chart I'm going to start with, and I'm using this as an outline. We're going to use it all the way through this series. If you notice at the very top line, we have on left and right the two orders, an explicate order and an implicate order. We are saying these two orders make up cosmology, and that cosmology also contains, in the external universe we have, the two orders of explicate and implicate order of our universe are held together by the Holomovement. In biblical cosmology, there is also an explicate order and an implicate order, and it is Christology that holds together biblical cosmology. Both the Holomovement and Christology are literally movements, movement or process. So I could say Christology is Christo movement, just as we have Holomovement between the orders of our universe. Now, there are elements that go with all of this, and I wanted to put these elements then in a chart to say, now here's the way I'd like to talk about it. There's law and there's grace. How do these relate? Well, they relate to the way these two orders are held together by Christology. So when you look at the left-hand column over here, we've got all of the elements that we're going to study in quite some detail that have to do with the outcome of the explicate order. What does it create? It creates bondage. It creates judgment. It requires a casting out. It manifests sin and death. It is based on a righteousness of my own. This explicate order under law requires self as source. However, the right-hand side in grace, in the implicate order of grace, the elements we're going to find are going to be in that order: freedom, salvation, acceptance, eternal life, new heaven and earth space, and we are going to find not a righteousness of our own, we are going to find God righteousness, or God as source of identity, not our doing as source of identity. Now, as you see, there's a middle column. That's Christology. Christology is the middle column. Christology, then we could say, is our Christo movement, right? It's our Christo process. What are the elements that belong to Christology? Well, with regard to bondage, Christology's action. What is its action? What is its motion? Its action or motion is one of deliverance that eventually will result into the movement from one order into the next, meaning the movement from bondage to freedom. But the action between bondage and freedom, the Christo action movement process, is one of deliverance. It's also one of mercy. Christology is that which reconciles and that which restores. Christology is related to the concept of resurrection, which we will talk about. It's related to the concept of crucifixion, which we are going to talk about, its role and function. Christology then plays a role and function in the center. If I were doing a Venn diagram, which I've spared you this time, I've done a chart. If I were doing a Venn diagram, all of the things in the middle would be in the overlap. And this is why in the article that I did with Dr. Jude Currivan and Dr. Kurt Johnson, Dr. Bob Atkinson, I put the Holomovement into a Venn, and I showed all the elements of the Holomovement and how the Holomovement is both an unfolding action that comes from a source beyond our universe and ends up manifesting forms or things, galaxies, etc. And with the advent of human consciousness, we humans take different types of forms, worldviews, etc., and we use the information that we gain from generation to generation to transform. And so the other aspect of the Holomovement is that it transforms, which is the direction back toward the source from which all things came, so that the Holomovement is a movement that both informs and transforms. So is the biblical narrative. Now, in the biblical narrative sense, Christology then is the motion or action. It is not the place. Freedom would be the place. What is deliverance? Deliverance is the way. Mercy is the way. Reconciliation is the way. God accepts all, brings about the restoration of all things. So now you can see how these things are appropriately put into their role and function, and how they lead to the movement in our cosmology. Now, the thing is, as a human being, we are in a biological form that belongs to the explicate order. So I'm in the explicate order and I'm in a biological form. But my identity is found in the right-hand column, which is God space. God is the source of my identity. I am innately a spiritual being in a biological form. So the question is, how do I navigate this, especially when we start talking about the role and function of the law? Because the law has been handed down through the world religion of Christianity in a way that is dysfunctional. That's our proposal. And that you will not be able to move forward as long as you interpret Christology as just a world religion. Now, I wanted to do one more chart on this, and that is one of my favorite passages. I've talked about this passage so many times. And this is Paul's cosmology. Paul's cosmology, because he has a very well developed, very specific cosmology. He has two orders, just as there are through the rest of the biblical narrative, which we will get into in detail. In Paul's Galatians 4 letter, he brings it out beautifully. He goes through the end of the chapter from like verse 21 to the end of the chapter, and he lays out cosmology that the explicate order is after the flesh, which for him, that's just another way of saying self is source. We're going to talk about that. But Paul's cosmology has an implicate order that is after the spirit, and that is God as source. So he uses symbols for this. His cosmology is full of symbolism. So he will use Hagar and Ishmael, Sinai, the first covenant, and the Jerusalem that was present in his day, the geographical Jerusalem, the Jerusalem in which he had taught and continued to teach until he was sent to the Gentiles. But yet he knew, after he had had his revelation from God, that there were other symbols for the implicate order. And those symbols revolved around Sarah, Isaac, Zion, a new covenant, and a new Jerusalem. A new Jerusalem that, again, is very much a cosmological term. The two Jerusalems, if you will, are representing two different worlds. And the new Jerusalem is transcending all that was identifiable in the previous explicate order. And the beauty is that the work of Christology is a work of unity and restoration. So, for example, because of the way the law was structured in the Hebrew culture, there was a necessity for Ishmael, under the laws of inheritance, to be cast out. We'll talk about that. And for the inheritance to be given to Isaac because of the culture and because of the way the inheritance structure was set up through genealogy. But what was the work of Christ? The work of Christ, Paul will say, to the people in Ephesus specifically, was to take down the wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, to take down the wall between Ishmael and Isaac, and to say that neither Ishmael nor Isaac the person, neither Judaism or what eventually became Islam through Ishmael, was going to be the point of the story, but rather the point of the story was going to be God as source, God alone. And in that sense, Ishmael and Isaac are going to be in this movement of reconcile and restore that you see there. That's the action, their relationship reconciled, restored. And the issue of casting out, we will talk about at great length. That's a subject that progressive progressive Christians just don't like to talk about. They don't like to talk about all of the teachings about casting out, teachings which the fundamentalists have used in saved lost paradigms and the teachings about hell. I will give the fundamentalists credit. They don't try to use their scissors and cut certain things out of the narrative that don't fit their paradigm. They do use the casting out scriptures. As a matter of fact, they focus on them, while the progressive Christians attempt to either ignore them or, in my opinion, dance around them. I'm going to talk about that in great detail. So here we've got cosmology. This cosmology, by the way, these elements are going to show up big time in Paul's cosmology down here. So let's start the discussion on the law. And I want to just bring this up at the very, very beginning. This question: was Paul confused? Or did Christianity confuse Paul's teachings? Who was confused? My experience has been with progressive Christians that they believe that Paul's story, his teachings are extremely confusing. Postmodern theologians in seminaries, when I read their theology, when I see what they're writing in their theological books, they also have been very big critics of Paul. Paul seems to stick out like a sore thumb, as if we would just stick to Jesus, if we just stick to the Gospels, that's all we need. We don't need anything further. And that Jesus never teaches anything but love and acceptance. Well, we're going to get into the teachings of Jesus because he has a lot to say about being cast out, being cast into a fire, being cast into outer darkness. It's not just Paul. Jesus has a lot to say about that. So, how do we reconcile that with universal God identity? How do we have a story that also eliminates these ideas of eternal torture that have been handed down and continue to be handed down by the fundamentalist crowd? That's why we have to go through this narrative in great detail. And while the outcome will be an outcome that I believe all progressive Christians want, on the other hand, it's going to cost them dearly when it comes to their perceived identity. And that's what I'm getting into now. The future of this planet is going to be one that is post-Christian and trans-religious. And there's a reason why. It's because that is the outcome taught by the biblical narrative if one applies a different lens to the interpretation of Christology. So when it comes to Paul, my opinion of Paul, brilliant, absolutely brilliant someone who obviously received a revelation on the road to Damascus that brought him great knowledge and understanding. And when Paul said, look, what's my role or function? My role or function is to reveal Christ. I might think to myself, wait a minute, what is there about Christ to be revealed that we don't already have in the Gospels? I mean, the Gospels tell the whole story of Jesus, all his teachings, his parables, the Beatitudes, everything that you would possibly need should be right in the Gospels. And I disagree with that. What was it then that Paul brought? Well, three things I'm going to talk about, the third one especially. First of all, Paul talked about Christology, revealing Christ. I came to reveal Christ. Christ is a movement, it's an action, it's Christology. The Gospels talk about Christology from a first person perspective, meaning it's all about Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is the first person initial foundational teachings about Christology. Christology as the individual Jesus. It's the foundation upon which Paul builds. Paul doesn't do away with that Christology. He basically says that's the foundation of my faith, is the faith of Christ. But what does Paul do then to reveal Christ? Paul is revealing second person. It's Paul that talks about the second person Christology, which is the collective. That's what second person is. It's the collective. What's the collective? It's the body. It's the body, also called ecclesia. And boy, that is where 2,000 years ago, that concept of ecclesia or church ran into a Christological interpretation that remains to today, and it has caused more division and more infighting that continues today and is accelerating, if anything. And that is why we're doing this series and re-looking at that old interpretation which Christianity continues to cling to. So Paul reveals Christology in second person, which we'll talk about. But the other thing that Paul does that I do want to talk about in great detail is he talks about law and grace. Paul tells us more about law and grace than anyone. He goes into great detail about law and grace. When I get done with this series, you may not agree with what I'm saying, but I will tell you this. I am digging into the whole of the scripture as I address everything I'm saying. I'm going to get into all of the scriptures that I've had people present to me as they've come through our place here in Atlanta for discussions or on internet and in Zoom calls. So we're going to use especially a lot that comes from Paul. Not only Paul, I'll bring in other, John's Revelation, teachings from Peter, etc. But especially Paul does a magnificent job if we see Paul in his proper setting. And the third thing that Paul does, of course, is what I talked about. He really goes into depth about the cosmology. He shows all the elements of the explicate order and all of the elements of the implicate order. And then with his Christology, he shows the beauty, the flow of that relationship. What confuses people is it would seem that Paul has two different perspectives about the law. And you know what? He does. He did. He had two perspectives about the law. But that's because there are two perspectives about law, its principles, and its role and function. First of all, Paul recognizes the law is good. So here's Paul talking to the Romans. He says, therefore, the law is holy, the commandment is holy and just and good. Ah, the law is good. All right, there we go. We've got Paul's teaching on the law. Until, of course, we go to his letter to the Corinthians. What does he say in that second letter. We, the followers of Christology, are ministers of a new covenant. I'm going to talk about covenant, not of the letter, Moses, the law, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So here's Paul saying, yeah, the law kills. Then he goes on to say, but if the ministry of death, written and engraven on stones, was glorious, oh, the law's a ministry of death? Okay. How will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious? For if the ministry of condemnation had glory, the ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory. Wait a minute. Now he's saying the law kills, the law brings death, and the law brings condemnation. This would not be a good marketing brochure for the law. But that's what law does. And all of these terms have to do with separation. And this is what makes Christianity so confusing. Christianity is based on division and separation. Christianity uses separation as its own identifier. What denomination are you? How do you separate yourself from all others who claim the word Christian? But for today's episode, I'll just point out that the law is good. In what way, Paul? Well, we're going to have to unpack that, aren't we? We're going to have to find out when the law is good or how the law is good. But the law also kills and brings death. Those are two completely different things, just like there are two different orders, an explicate and an implicate. Just like in our universe, there's a universe that requires time and space, and yet it's founded upon a source that transcends time and space, but that source is the source of the very universe that depends on time and space. How do these things hold together? One other quick thing I will say here, and that is 1 Corinthians 15:56. The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. There we now bring in the concept of sin. What is sin? We're going to have to talk about it. I've talked about it many times in previous episodes, but I want to talk about it here in light of cosmology. Biblical cosmology is an absolutely amazing perspective when it comes to pulling together numerous elements of the biblical narrative, which is what I'm attempting to do, to show the clarity, the beauty and the clarity of that narrative and the story and its outcome, and how amazing it is when we think about the potential for human beings on this planet to come together rather than to be divided. We're going to have to talk about what was the sin that entered the world. What is not just symptoms of sin. Symptom of sin is death. What is the root of what sin actually is? And we will get into that. Now, I've got a lot more to go. I'm not surprised I didn't get any further than I got right now, but that's all I'm going to dump on you for today. There's a lot to consider for this episode. I just want to review quickly before I wrap it up. There's two orders in our universe. There's two orders in the biblical narrative. There's a Holomovement that holds the two orders together in our universe, and there's a Christomovement or Christology that holds together the two orders in biblical cosmology. That both the Holomovement and Christology are action, movement. Movement is a process. The process or movement of Christology is one of deliverance, mercy, reconciliation, restoration, and resurrection that has a foundation of crucifixion, which is also an action taken by Jesus. All of these are Christological, and that Christology exists in both first and second person. So these actionable items are not just Jesus, the individual Christ. These items also apply equally to the collective called the body. The body was involved in the completion of all of these elements in the middle after Jesus had completed his foundational work. And that finally, as we will show here, Paul has a cosmology that is also very complete, and it represents two orders as well. And again, I will be going through this in quite some detail as we go along in this series. And let me take myself off and come back here. We're going to go through this in the series as we keep on going. And make sure I stop sharing. Sorry about that. Stop sharing that screen. And go through in great detail and unpack all of this. Again, there's been 2,000 years of teaching that has been grooved in our heads about Christology. To say that we could just sit here and do a quick presentation that reframes that, I think would be asking a little too much, right? So instead, what we're going to do is take our time and go through all of this, and we are going to see if we can't bring greater clarity. This is episode 1 of The Law and Grace. It's part of the Holomovement proposal. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining our conversation for a new earth.